It was a quiet October night, the kind that sank the small Midwestern town into a deep, eerie silence. Officer Mark Harris was patrolling the outskirts, a stretch of lonely highway bordered by thick woods. It was a shift he'd worked countless times, but tonight something felt off. He couldn't shake the prickling sensation crawling up his spine. Mark dismissed it as exhaustion. A night shift paired with dwindling caffeine reserves could mess with anyone's nerves. At 2:47 a.m., the dispatcher crackled to life. Unit 14, we've got a report of a 911 hang-up. Address is 76 Old Pine Road. Neighbors reported screams before the line disconnected. Mark frowned. That address was deep in the woods, long abandoned since the Parker family tragedy 2 decades prior. The story was grim. Parents and 3 kids, all slaughtered in their home. No suspects, no motives. Over the years, the Parker house had gained a reputation. Kids dared each other to visit, swearing they saw faces in the windows or heard whispers in the empty halls. Mark keyed the radio. Dispatch, are you sure about that address? Place has been empty for years. Confirmed, the dispatcher replied, her voice unusually tight. Caller ID traced it there. With a resigned sigh, Mark turned his cruiser toward Old Pine Road. The night seemed darker as he approached, his headlights barely cutting through the dense trees. Finally, the Parker house loomed into view, a hulking shadow against the moonlit sky. Its windows were broken, the paint peeling like dry skin. The air was still, almost suffocating. Mark parked, his gut screaming at him to leave. But duty called. As he approached the front porch, the floorboards creaked ominously under his boots. He knocked, his fist echoing through the empty structure. Police, is anyone here? No answer. The only response was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. He pushed the door open, its hinges wailing in protest. His flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating graffiti-covered walls and smashed furniture. The house smelled of mold and decay, an assault on his senses. But then he saw something that made his stomach drop. Fresh, muddy footprints leading from the front door deeper into the house. Dispatch, I'm at the scene. There are signs someone's inside. I'm investigating, Mark whispered into his radio. The dispatcher's reply was distorted, static-filled. He strained to hear her, but the line cut out entirely. His heart pounded as he followed the footprints down a narrow hallway. The air grew colder with each step, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight. Suddenly he heard it, a faint, wet sound like someone slurping or chewing. His pulse raced as he approached a partially open door at the end of the hall. The sound was coming from inside. Police! Show yourself! He barked, kicking the door open. The room was empty, save for a decrepit dining table and chairs. But the footprints ended here. Mark's flashlight flickered. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a shadow moving along the far wall, though there was nothing to cast it. The sound came again, louder this time, echoing from the basement. He swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at him to call for backup, but his radio was dead. Drawing his weapon, Mark descended the basement stairs. Each creak of the old wood sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. At the bottom, the smell hit him, coppery and sharp, blood. His flashlight revealed the source, a mutilated deer carcass sprawled across the floor, entrails strewn about like some grotesque display. But there was no one else there. His mind raced. The footprints were fresh. Someone had to be here. Then the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. Mark spun around, his flashlight cutting through the pitch-black basement. "Who's there?" he shouted. His voice echoed, but there was no reply. He bolted up the stairs and shoved at the door. It wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" he yelled, his fists pounding against the wood. Panic clawed at his chest. Behind him, the chewing sound began again, wet and deliberate. He whipped around, but the basement was empty, save for the carcass. The sound stopped. Silence. Then, faintly, a voice whispered his name. Mark. His blood ran cold. It wasn't just a whisper, it was familiar. His wife's voice. But she was at home, miles away. He scanned the basement, desperate to find the source. That's when he saw it, a figure in the corner, barely illuminated by his faltering flashlight. It was small, child-sized, crouched on the floor. "Hey!" Mark shouted, aiming his gun. The figure turned slowly, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a little girl, her face pale and streaked with blood. Her eyes, black, empty voids, stared straight through him. "Help me," she whimpered, her voice trembling. She reached out a hand, but it wasn't a hand at all. It was a twisted, gnarled claw. Mark froze, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. Then the girl smiled, revealing jagged, animalistic teeth. Before he could react, she lunged. He fired, the gunshots deafening in the confined space. When he opened his eyes, she was gone. The basement door creaked open behind him. Mark scrambled up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind him. He sprinted for the front door, his flashlight flailing wildly. As he reached the porch, he stopped short. His cruiser was gone. In its place was an older model police car, rusted and abandoned, with the same unit number as his own. "What the hell?" he whispered, backing away. The radio in his pocket crackled to life. "Unit 14, what's your status?" It was the dispatcher's voice, but it sounded distorted, warped. "I'm leaving the scene," Mark stammered. But as he spoke, he noticed something chilling. The house, the woods, even the sky. It all looked different, like he'd stepped back in time. The moon was full and unnaturally bright, casting an eerie glow over everything. The dispatcher's voice cut through the static again. "Mark, you're not leaving. You're already here." Suddenly, the front door swung open. Shadows spilled out onto the porch, writhing and shifting unnaturally. Mark turned and ran, but no matter how far he went, he couldn't escape the trees. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, the road vanishing behind him. Hours later, a passing trucker found Mark stumbling along the highway, his uniform torn and his face pale as death. He babbled incoherently about shadows and voices, clutching his badge like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. Mark never returned to duty. He spent the rest of his days institutionalized, haunted by things he couldn't explain. The Parker house was demolished shortly after, but locals still tell the story of the night Mark Harris disappeared for hours, only to emerge broken, as if he'd been lost somewhere no one was meant to go. The rain came down in torrents that night, transforming the narrow rural road into a slick, treacherous path. Deputy Sam Price gripped the wheel of his cruiser tightly, squinting through the windshield as the wipers struggled to keep up. It was nearing midnight, and he was only an hour away from finishing his shift. That's when the call came in. "Unit 12, respond to a possible 1054 on County Road 7, the dispatcher said. "Possible fatality." Sam sighed. It wasn't unusual to get accident reports during weather like this, but something about the tone of her voice unsettled him. "Copy that. En route," he responded, flipping on his lights. The road stretched endlessly, the only illumination coming from his headlights. His GPS pinged, signaling the approximate location. As he approached, Sam saw the faint outline of a wreck. A pickup truck had veered off the road, its front end crumpled against a tree. The engine was still steaming, and the windshield was shattered. He pulled over and grabbed his flashlight, stepping out into the downpour. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he called out, shining his beam into the vehicle. The driver's seat was empty, the door ajar. Blood stained the fabric and dripped onto the muddy ground. His heart quickened as he scanned the surrounding woods. The trees loomed like skeletal sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind. "Dispatch, I've got an abandoned vehicle." "Blood at the scene." "No sign of the driver," he reported. "Copy. Unit 12. Stand by." Sam crouched, his flashlight catching a set of footprints leading away from the truck and into the woods. They were uneven, as if the person had been limping. Despite the freezing rain soaking through his uniform, he followed the trail, his boots sinking into the muddy earth. The prints led deeper into the forest, where the air seemed heavier, thicker. The wind carried strange sounds, whispers, faint and almost unintelligible, but undeniably human. Sam paused, his flashlight flickering. He swung it around, but the beam barely pierced the oppressive darkness. "Hey, if you're out there, call out!" he shouted. Nothing. Only the sound of the rain and the distant rustling of leaves. He pressed forward, the footprints now mingled with streaks of blood. His chest tightened as the trail ended abruptly in a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated shed, its wooden walls warped and blackened with age. The roof sagged under the weight of years, and a faint, unnatural glow seeped through the cracks. Sam's radio crackled to life. "Unit 12, we're showing you off your designated path. What's your status?" He raised the device to his lips. "Following a blood trail. Leads to an old shed out here. Might have the driver inside." "Proceed with caution," the dispatcher warned. Her voice wavered slightly. Sam approached the shed, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back. The air was icy now, his breath visible even in the rain. He gripped his sidearm, nudging the door open with his foot. It swung inward with a groan, revealing a single, dimly lit room. The source of the glow was an old kerosene lamp on a rickety table. The walls were covered in strange symbols, crudely etched and dripping with what looked like fresh blood. A pile of mud-covered clothes sat in one corner, and in the center of the room lay the driver, or what was left of him. His chest had been torn open, ribs splayed like grotesque wings. His face was frozen in a silent scream, his empty eye sockets staring at the ceiling. Sam gagged, stumbling backward. That's when he heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he saw it. A hunched figure, unnaturally thin and impossibly tall, its skin stretched taut over sharp bones. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its mouth was filled with needle-like teeth. "Dispatch! I need backup now!" Sam shouted, raising his weapon. There was no response, only static. The creature lunged, moving with unnatural speed. Sam fired, the muzzle flashes lighting up the room in bursts of chaos. The thing screeched, its voice a horrifying blend of human and animal before disappearing into the shadows. Sam bolted from the shed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't stop running until he reached the road, where his cruiser waited like a lifeline. He jumped in and slammed the door, locking it as if that could protect him. His hands trembled as he fumbled for the radio. "Dispatch, I need immediate assistance," he yelled. The static cleared and a voice came through. But it wasn't the dispatcher. It was low, distorted, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have come." The radio went dead. The cruiser's engine sputtered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. Rain battered the windows as the shadows outside seemed to move, closing in. Sam drew his weapon, his breath ragged. The windshield cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading as something slammed against it. A face appeared, pressed against the glass, its eyes glowing with that same hellish light. It grinned, its teeth scraping against the window. Sam screamed as the glass shattered. The next morning, his cruiser was found abandoned on the side of the road. The driver's side door hung open, and the interior was soaked with blood. Deputy Sam Price was never seen again, but locals still talk about the night he disappeared. They warn travelers to avoid County Road 7 after dark. They say something lives in those woods, something ancient and hungry, waiting for the next unwary soul to wander too close. The storm was relentless that night, sheets of rain pounding the windshield as Officer Julie Kincaid navigated the winding back roads of her rural precinct. Her patrol was uneventful so far, aside from the occasional deer darting into her headlights. She was ready to call it a quiet night when the radio crackled. "Unit 19, we've got a report of suspicious activity at the old Grayson Asylum." Neighbor heard screams and saw lights inside. Julie frowned. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, its crumbling halls overrun with vines and graffiti. Local teens often dared each other to explore it, but no one ever stayed long. The stories about the place were enough to send even the boldest kids running. "Copy that," she responded, turning her cruiser onto the road leading to the asylum. The building soon emerged from the darkness, an imposing silhouette against the stormy sky. Lightning illuminated its shattered windows and sagging roof, giving it an almost lifelike appearance. Julie parked near the rusted front gates, pulling her flashlight and radio from the car. Rain soaked through her uniform as she approached, the gates groaning in protest when she pushed them open. The air inside the grounds felt heavier, colder, like stepping into another world. The main entrance door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. She stepped inside, the sound of her boots echoing in the vast, empty lobby. Her flashlight beam swept across peeling wallpaper, scattered debris, and broken furniture. "This is Officer Kincaid with the county police," she called out. Her voice sounded small in the cavernous space. "If anyone's here, make yourself known." Nothing, just the distant drip of water from the leaking roof. She moved deeper into the asylum, the smell of mildew and decay growing stronger. Her flashlight caught glimpses of old medical equipment, rusted wheelchairs, overturned gurneys, shattered glass vials. The stories about the Grayson Asylum came rushing back. Tales of inhumane experiments, patients who vanished without explanation, and staff who reportedly heard voices long after the building was abandoned. A loud crash shattered the silence. Julie spun around, her heart racing. The sound had come from somewhere upstairs. Hand on her holstered weapon, she climbed the staircase, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "Police!" she shouted again. "I'm armed, and I will defend myself." The second floor was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and doorways leading to empty patient rooms. Her flashlight flickered, casting unsettling shadows that danced along the walls. She followed the sound to a room at the end of the hall. The door was partially closed, the faint glow of a light seeping through the crack. She pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. Sitting on it was an old-fashioned reel-to-reel tape recorder, its reels spinning slowly. A scratchy, distorted voice crackled from the machine. "Help us. Please." Julie's blood ran cold. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. The tape continued to play, the voice growing more frantic, more pained. "They're here. They never left." Suddenly, the tape recorder stopped, its reels freezing in place. The room was silent for a moment before a deafening bang came from the hall behind her. She spun around, her flashlight illuminating a tall, shadowy figure standing at the far end of the corridor. It didn't move, but she felt its gaze boring into her. "Stop!" she shouted, drawing her weapon. "Stay where you are." The figure stepped backward into the shadows, disappearing as if it had melted into the darkness. Julie's breath came in short, ragged gasps. She advanced cautiously, sweeping her flashlight down the corridor. The air grew colder, her breath forming clouds in front of her. As she approached the end of the hallway, a door on her left creaked open. She hesitated, then stepped inside. The room was eerily empty, but on the far wall, words had been scrawled in dark, dripping letters. "Leave now or join us." The room's temperature plummeted, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, heavy, deliberate, and growing closer. Julie turned and bolted, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she fled down the stairs. The footsteps followed, louder and faster, as if whatever was chasing her was right on her heels. She reached the lobby, her boots skidding on the wet floor. She darted for the exit, but the front doors slammed shut with a deafening crash. The shadows around her seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing as whispers filled the air. "Stay with us." "No," she screamed, yanking at the doors. They wouldn't budge. A guttural growl came from behind her. She turned slowly, her flashlight trembling in her grip. A figure stood in the center of the lobby, its features obscured by the shadows, but its eyes, two burning orbs of crimson, pierced through the darkness, locking onto her. Julie raised her weapon. "Don't come any closer." The thing tilted its head, its lips curling into a jagged, unnatural smile. It stepped forward, its movements jerky and inhuman, came like a puppet on broken strings. Julie fired. The shots rang out, echoing through the asylum, but the figure didn't falter. It only grinned wider. Desperation took over. Julie turned and rammed her shoulder into the doors. They burst open, and she stumbled outside, rain pelting her as she sprinted for her cruiser. She dove inside and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and she sped away, the asylum fading into the storm behind her. She didn't stop until she reached the station, her hands shaking as she relayed what had happened. Her colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't press her for details. No one volunteered to go back to the Grayson Asylum that night. The next day, a search team was sent to investigate. They found no trace of Julie's encounter. No tape recorder, no figure, no writing on the wall. But near the chair on the second floor, they found her spent shell casings. And just outside the front door, etched into the stone steps, was a single word: soon. Julie resigned from the force the following week. She moved out of town, refusing to speak of that night again. But those who've since passed by the Grayson Asylum say they've seen lights in the windows and heard faint screams echoing through the night. The locals know better than to investigate. Some places, they say, are better left undisturbed. It was just past 11 p.m. when Officer Daniel Vega got the call. A 911 operator had received a frantic message. A woman screaming, "They're inside! Please help!" Before the line abruptly went dead. The location was an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, miles from the nearest neighbor. Dispatch had tried calling back, but no one answered. Daniel was the closest unit and reluctantly agreed to check it out. He'd heard the stories about that farmhouse. Everyone had. The place had been abandoned for decades, following a string of mysterious deaths. Squatters occasionally broke in, but none ever stayed long. The drive out was lonely, the empty roads lit only by the pale glow of his headlights. When Daniel reached the property, the house loomed in the darkness, its warped wooden frame leaning as if under the weight of years of decay. The windows were dark, except for one upstairs, where a faint light flickered like a dying candle. He stepped out of the cruiser, his boots crunching on the gravel. The wind howled through the trees, carrying an eerie, almost human-like wail. "Dispatch, I'm on scene," he said into his radio. "Farmhouse appears abandoned. I see a light on the second floor. Proceeding to investigate." "Copy, Unit 23. Be advised, backup is 15 minutes out." He approached the house, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the wind. "Police! Is anyone inside?" he called out, stepping into the entryway. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and rot. His flashlight illuminated a hallway cluttered with debris, broken furniture, shattered picture frames, and an overturned table. A sudden thud echoed from upstairs, followed by a faint sobbing. Daniel's grip tightened on his flashlight as he slowly ascended the creaking staircase. His hand hovered near his holstered weapon. "Hello, this is the police. I'm here to help," he said, his voice steady despite the unease crawling up his spine. The sobbing grew louder as he reached the second-floor landing. It was coming from a room at the end of the hall, the one with the flickering light. The door was slightly open, revealing a sliver of a dimly lit interior. Daniel pushed it open with his flashlight. The room was empty. No furniture, no light source, just bare walls covered in deep scratches, as if someone had clawed at them in desperation. The sobbing had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. Daniel felt a cold draft at his back. He spun around, his flashlight sweeping the hallway. It was empty, but he could have sworn he saw a shadow darting into another room. His radio crackled. "Unit 23, do you copy?" He grabbed it, his voice taut. "I'm inside, second floor. Hearing strange noises, possible intruder. Need an ETA on backup. Static." Then, faintly, a voice whispered through the radio. "Leave." Daniel froze. It wasn't the dispatcher. The voice was low, rasping, and filled with malice. A loud crash came from downstairs, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Daniel bolted down the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. In the living room, a chair rocked violently as if someone had just stood up from it, but the room was empty. "Show yourself," he yelled, his voice echoing through the house. The only reply was a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows in the corner of the room. He aimed his flashlight, but the beam flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. Panicked, he fumbled for his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup now. There's something in here with me?" No response. Just the faint sound of static, interspersed with what sounded like faint laughter. Then he heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the ceiling directly above him. He looked up, dread tightening his chest. In the dim light from his radio screen, he saw them. Long, clawed fingers reaching through the cracks in the wooden boards, scraping slowly, deliberately. Something heavy began moving across the ceiling, its weight causing the beams to groan. Daniel backed away, his weapon drawn, when the scratching stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. Then, without warning, the trapdoor to the attic above him slammed open, and a figure dropped down. It wasn't human. The thing was emaciated, its skin stretched tightly over its bones. Its face was a hollow void, with deep, empty sockets where eyes should have been. It moved with unnatural speed, lunging toward Daniel on all fours, its mouth opening in a silent scream that revealed rows of jagged teeth. Daniel fired, the muzzle flashes lighting up the room in bursts. The creature recoiled but didn't fall. Instead, it crawled up the wall and vanished into the shadows. Breathing heavily, Daniel bolted for the front door, his pulse hammering in his ears. As he reached the porch, he turned back to see the creature standing in the doorway, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It raised one bony finger and pointed directly at him. The porch light flickered, and suddenly the creature was gone. Daniel didn't stop running until he reached his cruiser. He jumped in, locked the doors, and peeled away from the farmhouse. In his rearview mirror, he saw the faint flicker of light in the second-story window again, as if the house itself was watching him leave. When backup arrived 20 minutes later, they found the house completely empty. No blood, no shell casings, no signs of struggle, just an old decaying farmhouse that had been untouched for years. Daniel filed his report but couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, he heard it again. The faint sound of scratching, this time coming from his bedroom ceiling. He didn't sleep, and he never went back to the farmhouse. It was a cold October night, and Officer Mark Reynolds was on the tail end of his shift. The quiet roads of his rural town made for an uneventful evening, and he was counting down and down the minutes until he could clock out. That's when the call came in. Unit 34, we've got a report of a vehicle stalled on Route 6 near Black Hollow Bridge. Driver says someone's been following him. Please investigate. Mark sighed. Black Hollow Bridge. Locals avoided it, claiming it was haunted. People whispered about a woman who had died there decades ago, her car plunging into the icy river below. Some said she still roamed the area, searching for help. Mark didn't believe in ghosts, but the thought of standing on that bridge in the dead of night wasn't exactly appealing. Still, duty was duty. He acknowledged the call and headed out. The bridge came into view, its iron trusses looming against the pale light of the moon. The stalled car sat in the middle of the bridge, its hazard lights flashing weakly. Mark pulled up behind it, his cruiser's headlights cutting through the thick fog that clung to the riverbanks. He stepped out, flashlight in hand. The air was colder here, biting through his uniform. He approached the vehicle and tapped on the driver's window. The man inside, pale and visibly shaking, rolled it down. "Officer, thank God you're here," the man stammered. I don't know how to explain this, but someone's been following me. I thought I lost them, but then my car just stopped, like it died on its own." Mark glanced around, shining his flashlight into the fog. "Did you see who it was? A person? Another vehicle?" The man hesitated. "It wasn't a person, at least I don't think it was." Before Mark could ask what he meant, a loud metallic clang echoed from the far end of the bridge. The sound reverberated through the steel beams, like making Mark's skin crawl. "Stay here," he instructed the driver, hand instinctively moving to his holstered weapon. He walked toward the sound, his boots clanking on the metal grating of the bridge. The fog seemed to thicken, muffling the world around him. His flashlight caught glimpses of the river below, its dark waters swirling ominously. Another sound, a faint, mournful cry, rose from somewhere ahead. It was barely audible, but it sent a chill down his spine. He pressed on, his flashlight beam dancing along the beams of the bridge. That's when he saw her. A woman stood near the edge, her back to him. She wore a tattered white dress that clung to her thin frame, her long, dark hair hanging in damp strands. She swayed slightly, as if caught in a breeze that Mark couldn't feel. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice firm. "Are you all right?" She didn't respond. Slowly, she turned to face him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to suck in the light. Her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, too wide for her face. She took a step toward him, her movements jerky and inhuman. "Help me," she said, her voice a raspy whisper that echoed unnaturally. Mark stumbled back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Stay back," he warned, drawing his weapon. The woman tilted her head, her grin widening. Her form began to shift, her limbs elongating grotesquely. She let out a shrill scream that seemed to come from all around him, piercing and deafening. Mark fired. The gunshots echoed, but the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she vanished, dissolving into the fog like smoke. The bridge went silent. Mark stood frozen, his heart pounding in his ears. Then he heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and coming from behind him. He spun around, his flashlight sweeping the fog. At first, he saw nothing. Then, slowly, a shadow emerged. It was tall and misshapen, its outline flickering as if it wasn't entirely solid. Red eyes glowed from the darkness, locked onto him. Mark ran. He sprinted back to the car, shouting for the driver to lock the doors. As he reached the cruiser, he turned back one last time. The figure stood in the middle of the bridge, watching. Its eyes burned brighter, and it raised one elongated arm, pointing directly at him. Mark jumped into his cruiser and radioed for backup. His voice trembled as he tried to explain what he'd seen, but the static on the other end drowned out his words. The fog grew denser, wrapping around the car like a shroud. The driver of the stalled vehicle screamed. Mark whipped around to see the man's car rocking violently, as if something unseen was trying to flip it over. The windows fogged up from the inside, handprints smearing across the glass. Mark hit the gas, his tires screeching as he sped off the bridge. The other car was still behind him, but he couldn't stop, couldn't risk it. Only when he was miles away did he pull over to catch his breath. The driver's car was gone. There were no taillights, no sign it had followed him. Mark sat in his cruiser, shaking until his radio crackled to life. "Unit 34, what's your status?" He hesitated, staring at the fog-covered road ahead. "Dispatch, I don't know what just happened." The next morning, a search team found the driver's car on the bridge. The engine was dead and the doors were locked. The man was nowhere to be found, but his seatbelt was still fastened, and the inside of the windows were covered in smeared handprints. Mark transferred to another precinct a week later. He never drove near Black Hollow Bridge again. Locals say the fog is thicker there than anywhere else, and on quiet nights, you can hear a faint, mournful cry carried on the wind. Officer Karen Diaz had seen her fair share of strange calls, but the one that came in at 2:45 a.m. that rainy November night was different. The dispatcher's voice was unusually tense as they relayed the details. A 911 call from a child, whispered and barely audible, saying, "They're in the walls. Please help us." The address was an old Victorian house on the edge of town. It had once been a boarding house, but was abandoned after a series of gruesome murders decades ago. Despite its decrepit state, the property had recently been sold to a family, a single mother and her 2 young children. Karen had driven past it a few times during her patrols. It always seemed to loom ominously, its broken shutters and peeling paint giving it an almost sentient presence. Karen arrived to find the house bathed in eerie silence, its windows dark. Rain slicked the cracked driveway as she approached, flashlight in hand. The front door was ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. She called out, "This is Officer Diaz. Is anyone here?" But was met with only the sound of the rain and the faint groan of the house settling. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, carrying a faint, sour odor. Karen's flashlight illuminated the faded wallpaper and dusty furniture. Toys were scattered across the living room floor, a doll missing an eye, a teddy bear with its stuffing spilling out. It was too quiet, unnaturally so. "Hello?" She called again, her voice echoing in the cavernous house. "This is the police. I'm here to help." A sudden noise came from upstairs, a muffled thump, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Karen's hand instinctively moved to her holstered weapon as she climbed the staircase, the old wooden steps groaning under her weight. The hallway at the top was long and narrow, lined with doors on either side. At the far end, a faint light flickered beneath one of the doors. Karen approached cautiously, her flashlight sweeping across the peeling wallpaper. "Ma'am? Kids? It's Officer Diaz," she said, her voice steady despite the unease crawling up her spine. She reached the door and knocked. No response. Slowly, she pushed it open. The room was empty, except for a mattress on the floor and a single light bulb swinging from the ceiling. But something caught her eye. Smeared on the walls in what looked like crayon were dozens of childish drawings. They depicted stick figures with wide black eyes standing in the corners of rooms, hiding under beds, crawling through cracks in the walls. The words, "They watch," were scrawled repeatedly, overlapping in frantic, uneven strokes. A soft rustling sound came from behind her. Karen turned sharply, her flashlight illuminating the hallway. At first, she saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a vent at floor level, its metal grate slightly askew. "Mom?" a small voice whispered from within. Karen crouched down, her heart racing. "Sweetheart, are you okay? Are you stuck in there?" The voice was trembling. "They're in the walls. They said not to tell." Karen froze, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. The voice didn't come from the vent. It came from the air around her, as if the house itself were speaking. Before she could respond, a loud bang reverberated through the house, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor downstairs. Karen stood, drawing her weapon. She descended the stairs quickly but cautiously, her flashlight cutting through the thick shadows. In the living room, the furniture had been rearranged. The couch now sat in the middle of the room, facing the wall, as if someone or something had been watching it. A faint sobbing drew her attention to a doorway leading to the basement. Karen hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to go down there, but the sobbing continued, desperate and plaintive. She gripped her flashlight tightly and descended the creaking wooden steps. The basement smelled of damp earth and mildew. Her flashlight revealed brick walls lined with shelves full of forgotten junk, rusted tools, broken jars, and piles of old newspapers. In the corner, she saw them. 2 children, huddled together, their faces pale and tear-streaked. "Hey, it's okay, I'm here to help," Karen said softly, lowering her weapon. She approached slowly, but the children didn't move. They just stared at her with wide, frightened eyes. "They're here." the boy whispered, his voice trembling. Karen crouched down, her pulse quickening. Who's here? Is your mom with you? The girl pointed behind Karen, her finger shaking. Karen turned, her flashlight beam landing on a far wall. At first, it looked like nothing, just bricks and mortar. But then she saw it, a faint outline, like a figure pressed against the wall from the other side, its limbs contorted in impossible angles. The outline shifted. Slowly, a hand began to push through the bricks, followed by an arm, its movements jerky and unnatural. The bricks didn't crumble, they seemed to dissolve around the figure, as if the wall itself were releasing it. Karen stumbled back, grabbing the children and pulling them behind her. The thing stepped fully into the room, a tall, skeletal figure with skin as pale as ash. Its face was featureless except for two black, bottomless holes where its eyes should have been. It moved toward them, its head tilting unnaturally as if studying them. "Stay back!" Karen shouted, firing her weapon. The shots rang out, deafening in the confined space, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it cocked its head and reached out with one long, bony finger, pointing at her. The walls around them began to writhe, bulging and contracting as more figures started to emerge, their eyeless faces and twisted limbs pushing through the bricks. Karen grabbed the children and bolted up the stairs. The house groaned as if alive, the walls shaking violently. She made it to the front door, shoving it open and dragging the children outside. Rain poured down as she stumbled to her cruiser, shoving the kids into the back seat. She radioed for backup, her voice shaking. "This is Officer Diaz. I need immediate assistance at the Old Victorian on Route 9. I've got 2 children, but the house! There's something in the house!" She glanced back at the house. Through the rain, she saw figures in the windows, dozens of them, their black eyes staring out at her. One of them raised a hand and waved slowly, mockingly. Backup arrived minutes later, but when the officers entered the house, it was empty. No sign of the figures, the children's mother, or even the crayon drawings on the walls. The house was silent, as if nothing had happened. The children were taken to safety, but Karen couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't done. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those black, empty sockets staring back at her. And every so often, in the dead of night, she thought she heard faint whispers, like voices carried through the walls. Officer Jason Miller had been on the force for nearly 15 years, but nothing prepared him for the call that came in on a cold, quiet night in December. The dispatcher's voice sounded strained as she relayed the details. Neighbors had reported screams coming from an abandoned apartment building on the edge of town, known locally as the Hollow Point. The building had been empty for years after a string of violent incidents drove tenants away. It was rumored that strange things happened there. Whispers of cults, missing persons, and shadows that moved when no one was around. But Jason wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. Still, the reports of screams were real enough. When he arrived, the building stood like a dark monolith, its windows broken and walls covered in graffiti. The air around it was eerily still, as if the entire area were holding its breath. He parked his cruiser, stepped out, and immediately felt a strange pressure in the air, like a storm was about to break. The front door was ajar, hanging on its rusted hinges. He shone his flashlight into the darkness. "This is Officer Miller. If anyone's in here, make yourself known." His voice echoed back at him, hollow and distorted. The inside of the building smelled of mildew and decay. Trash littered the floors, and the walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper. Jason moved cautiously, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness. He heard it again, a muffled scream coming from somewhere deeper inside. It was faint but unmistakable. He radioed in. "Dispatch, I'm entering the building. Possible victim inside. Request backup." Static crackled in response, followed by a faint voice. "Leave now." Jason froze, his pulse quickening. "Dispatch? Say again?" But the radio went dead. The scream came again, louder this time, and Jason pressed forward. He found a staircase leading to the second floor, its steps creaking ominously under his weight. The air grew colder as he ascended, his breath now visible in the dim light. On the second floor, the hallway stretched out before him, lined with doors that seemed to lead nowhere. At the far end, one door stood slightly ajar. Light flickered from within, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. Jason approached slowly, his hand on his holstered weapon. He nudged the door open with his flashlight. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center, facing a mirror that was cracked and smeared with something dark. On the walls, words were scrawled in what looked like black ink, or was it blood? Repeating the same phrase over and over, "Do not look." As he stepped closer to the mirror, the light in the room flickered and the air seemed to hum with static. Jason's reflection was there, but it wasn't right. It moved independently, its eyes fixed on him while his remained wide with confusion. Slowly, the reflection raised a hand, its mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. Jason staggered back, his flashlight trembling. Then, the reflection stepped out of the mirror. Jason's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. The figure standing before him was identical to him, but wrong. Its eyes were sunken and dark, its skin pale and stretched tight over its face. It moved toward him with unnatural speed, its mouth opening wide to let out a shriek that sounded like a mix of static and screaming. Jason fired his weapon. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the confined space, but the figure didn't falter. Instead, it lunged at him, its cold, bony hands gripping his arm. He struggled, feeling his strength drain as the thing stared into his eyes, its mouth whispering unintelligible words that burrowed into his mind like worms. Desperate, Jason kicked the chair toward the creature, breaking its hold on him for a moment. He scrambled out of the room and back into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind him. The hallway had changed. It stretched endlessly now, the walls seeming to pulse as if alive. From behind every door, he heard whispers, some pleading for help, others laughing mockingly. The lights overhead flickered wildly, plunging him into brief bursts of darkness. He ran, his boots pounding against the warped floorboards. But no matter how far he ran, the hallway never ended. The whispers grew louder, merging into a deafening cacophony. Jason tripped, his flashlight skidding across the floor. As he scrambled to pick it up, he saw them. Shadows emerging from the walls, their forms twisting and writhing. They had no eyes, only gaping black holes where their faces should have been, and their elongated arms reached out for him. He fired his weapon again and again, but the shadows were unbothered. One of them grabbed his leg, its touch icy and burning at the same time. Jason screamed, kicking wildly, and managed to break free. He bolted toward the staircase, which had reappeared in the distance. The shadows followed, their movements eerily silent except for the faint sound of whispers that seemed to come from inside his own head. Jason stumbled down the stairs, nearly losing his footing as the shadows closed in. Finally, he burst out of the front door and into the cold night air. He collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. When he looked back at the building, it was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Backup arrived minutes later, finding Jason sitting in his cruiser, pale and shaking. He tried to explain what had happened, but his words came out disjointed and panicked. The officers searched the building but found no signs of anyone. No screams, no shadows, no strange writings on the walls. Jason didn't return to duty after that night. He left town altogether, unable to shake the feeling that something from the hollow point had followed him. In his dreams, he still saw his reflection stepping out of the mirror, its twisted grin promising that it wasn't over. And late at night, in the quiet corners of his new home, Jason sometimes heard faint whispers coming from the walls. Officer Rachel Hayes had worked the night shift for years in her small, quiet town. Most calls were routine, domestic disputes, suspicious noises, or drunk drivers. But the call she received on a foggy autumn night was different. The dispatcher's voice was shaky. "Unit 12, we've got a report of a man standing on the side of County Road 17. Caller says he's been standing there for hours, not moving. No vehicle in sight. Could be a stranded motorist, but they say he's just staring." Rachel acknowledged the call and drove out toward the stretch of road in question. County Road 17 was desolate, running through miles of thick woods. Few houses lined the road, and those that did were often abandoned. Locals called it the Lost Mile, saying strange things happened there. Disappearances, sightings of shadowy figures, whispers carried on the wind. Rachel didn't put much stock in ghost stories, but the idea of someone stranded out there in the cold unsettled her. The fog hung low and thick as she drove, her headlights barely piercing the darkness. She spotted him after about 10 minutes, a man standing perfectly still on the shoulder of the road. She slowed her cruiser and pulled over, leaving the engine running. The man was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a black suit. His head was tilted slightly downward, and his face was obscured by the fog. Rachel stepped out, hand on her flashlight. "Sir, this is Officer Hayes with the County Sheriff's Department. Are you okay? Do you need assistance?" The man didn't respond or move. Rachel approached cautiously, shining her flashlight on him. As the beam illuminated his face, she stopped short. His features were wrong, blurry like a smudged photograph. His eyes were too large, and his mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that were unnervingly sharp. But the worst part was his skin. It looked like wax, too smooth, too perfect. "Sir?" she said again, her voice faltering. "Are you hurt?" He turned his head slowly toward her, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a marionette. His eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a wave of nausea wash over her as if something was pressing down on her chest. Then he spoke. His voice was distorted, as though it was coming from a broken radio. "You shouldn't have stopped." Rachel's blood ran cold. She took a step back, her hand moving instinctively to her gun. "Stay where you are." The man didn't move at first, but then he smiled. A grotesque, too-wide grin that seemed to split his face. Slowly, he raised one arm, pointing into the woods. Rachel followed his gesture, her flashlight sweeping through the trees. At first, she saw nothing. Then she caught movement, shadows shifting unnaturally, their shapes indistinct. They darted between the trees, too fast to be human. The flashlight's beam flickered as the shadows moved closer, and she could hear something now, low whispers, growing louder, overlapping into a chaotic cacophony. Rachel backed toward her cruiser, her heart pounding. "Get on the ground," she shouted at the man, her voice shaking. "Now!" The man tilted his head, his grin never wavering. "They're hungry," he said, and then his body collapsed in on itself like a deflated balloon, melting into the ground. Rachel barely had time to process what she'd seen before the shadows emerged from the woods. They weren't human. Their forms were constantly shifting, dark and oily, with glowing red eyes that burned like embers. They moved like smoke, twisting and writhing as they closed in. Rachel fired her weapon, the sound of gunfire tearing through the night. The bullets passed through the shadows as if they weren't there. One of them reached out with a long, clawed appendage, slashing at her cruiser. The metal screamed as deep gashes appeared in the door. She scrambled inside, slamming the door shut and throwing the car into reverse. The shadows swarmed around the vehicle, their whispers turning into a deafening roar. The windshield cracked as one of them slammed into it, its red eyes peering inside. Rachel floored the gas pedal, spinning the car around and racing down the road. The shadows followed, flowing like a dark tide, their glowing eyes reflecting in her rearview mirror. She radioed for backup, her voice frantic. "Dispatch, I need immediate assistance on County Road 17. Something's out here. I don't know what, but I need help." Static answered her. Then, faintly, she heard the same distorted voice as the man's. "You shouldn't have stopped." The shadows were gaining on her, their forms becoming more defined. She saw arms, legs, and faces twisted in silent screams emerging from the darkness. The cruiser's engine roared as she pushed it to its limit, the headlights barely cutting through the fog. Ahead, she saw a faint light, an intersection with another road. Safety. As she reached the intersection, the shadows stopped abruptly, retreating into the fog as if an invisible barrier held them back. Rachel didn't stop until she was miles away, pulling over at a gas station where the fluorescent lights felt like salvation. When backup arrived, they found her shaking, pale, and struggling to explain what had happened. A team was sent to investigate County Road 17, but they found no man, no shadows, and no damage to the cruiser. However, they did find deep claw marks etched into the pavement where Rachel said the shadows had swarmed. Rachel quit the force a week later. She refused to talk about what had happened, but locals say she became obsessed with the area around County Road 17. Some nights, she could be seen parked at the intersection, staring down the foggy stretch of road as if waiting for something. One night, she disappeared. Her abandoned car was found at the edge of the woods near the Lost Mile. The driver's side door was wide open, and claw marks scored the ground around it. Her flashlight lay on the road, its beam pointing toward the trees. And in the distance, some say they still see a tall, thin man standing on the side of the road, smiling.